Tax cuts, military spending or council bailouts, some of the choices for the Chancellor. And should pupils be able to pray in school? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP and Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Cairns. Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry. Columnist from the I paper, Andrew Fisher. And Telegraph columnist, Madeline Grant. On today's programme.
The fact that we managed the economy responsibly over the last year, bringing inflation down from 11% to 4%, has meant that we can start cutting people's taxes.
The Prime Minister raises expectations of giveaways at the budget.
Iran, North Korea, and non-state actors, Daesh and all the rest of them, joining together and using more sophisticated weapons. And so all of that combines to a more dangerous world.
But if the Defence Secretary is right, do we need to spend more on the military?
We're seeing councils hit the wall. We're seeing councils looking at having to make significant cuts to services this year unless there is more support.
Or should councils be bailed out with any spare cash the Chancellor might have?
Oh, everybody's coming to talk to me now.
Is Britain's strictest head teacher right to ban prayer in her school?
We don't have a clear path to victory. Accordingly, I am today suspending my campaign.
He was very gracious and he endorsed me, so I appreciate it.
And has America just moved a step closer to a second Trump presidency? Well, let's start with that story you just heard and saw at the end of the headlines, because, yes, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, has dropped out of the race to become the Republican nomination. And it looks as if Donald Trump is a step closer, certainly to the nomination, if not to the presidency. But you tweeted this, Alicia, over the weekend. It's 2024 and people are seriously calling for someone to be president of the USA who falsely claims the last election was stolen from them, will face charges for inciting insurrection, was found liable of sexually abusing a woman, obstructed investigations, abused his power to pardon his friends, and has indictments which amount to a total of 91 felony charges. Completely mind-blowing. It's clear where you stand, of course, but actually, as we have just said, do British politicians perhaps need to get used to the idea of a Trump presidency or Trump back in the White House?
So I think it's amazing how many people do seem to disagree with me based on the Twitter response I got. It was the last thing I sent before I went to sleep, and I woke up to a quiet response. But I was in DC last week, and look, clearly there is a lot of momentum behind Trump. But at the same time, 50% of Republican voters in Iowa did not pick Trump. And the last two people who won Iowa did not go on to be the candidate. You know, Nikki Haley, you know, she's got a good chance. She's got big backers. She's the closest to a Reaganite person we've got. And New Hampshire and obviously South Carolina, hopefully, is where we'll see her really start to take on momentum, really.
Madeline, what did you think? Was Alicia right to tweet what she did about Trump?
Well, Alicia should tweet whatever she wants. I mean, I don't think it makes a great deal of difference to anything what our backbenchers or indeed commentators in the UK think. You know, if America is going to choose Trump, they're going to choose Trump. But I do think there is generally a problem where, in general, we fail to understand Trump properly because we tend to look at the worst things that he's said and actually not looking at his overall record and the reasons why people in America might feel strongly about him and want him, and the way in which on some calls he has actually been very prescient, for example, on migration. I would say that's the significant one where, you know, where we in Europe were, people like Angela Merkel was saying refugees welcome. Trump was actually well ahead of the curve, and now very many countries around the world are now proposing policies quite similar to what Trump was calling for. So I don't know. I mean, I think our politicians are focused on doing what is best for UK citizens, and actually I would say it's looking very likely that we will get a Trump presidency, so perhaps we need to get used to that idea.
Well, you said this, Emily, a little while ago when you were Shadow Foreign Secretary in the independent Trump UK visit. Labour's Emily Thornberry launches scathing attack on racist president ahead of official trip. This president doesn't deserve the honour of a state visit. He is not welcome. Do you still stand by those comments?
I also said that America was our friends, that we had many close friends. We have, essentially they are relatives of ours, and we want to be able to work with America. And, we would have to work with whoever the president was.
And would you repeat those comments now ahead of a possible Trump presidency again?
Oh, look, I stand by it. But the fact is that we have to work with him. I also think that, that it's right to be a bit more Merkel than May when it comes to dealing with President Trump. I think you should stand up to bullies and you should be clear about what it is you stand for.
Interestingly,
your principles.
Well, the now shadow Foreign Secretary, your colleague David Lammy, has said he doesn't regret calling Donald Trump a racist and a Nazi sympathiser. But when he was asked about those comments, again, I think it was over the weekend or at the end of last week, he said he didn't regret them, but he said them from the back benches. And he said a Labour government would work with Mr Trump if he were to become president again. What do you make? Do British politicians just need to get with the idea that they could be dealing with Donald Trump again?
Well, they might well be able to. That's a decision for the US electorate ultimately. But it's part of a wider and I think quite worrying trend around the globe, actually. It's not just Trump in the US, of politicians being elected democratically who don't actually believe in democracy. You have Trump in the US who clearly, if the result doesn't go his way, says it's a sham, I won anyway. You have Orban in Hungary, you have Modi in India, you have Netanyahu, restricting the courts in Israel before the latest conflagration. And you've seen elements of it with this Conservative government as well, clamping down on protest, on trade union rights for industrial action, on the right to judicial review, on legal aid. You see people, politicians that want to restrict other people's power,
what do you do about it?
Strengthen their own. I think you have to win. You have to win the democratic argument for these things, and that's part of the challenge. And I think a lot of the time their opponents are very weak in putting forward a counterpoint view to it and say, well, maybe he's got a reasonable point on this and this sort of thing. And that just actually just turns the turf over to these people. And you've got to, take on populists like that.
Is it a worrying trend in the way Andrew's described?
I think it's very worrying that Donald Trump denied the election, of course. I think that there's been a real failure of faith in democracy around the globe that troubles me. I think it's a massive stretch to compare that to anything that has happened in this country, frankly. We've had our differences, and actually we did have a period where there was massive pushback against Brexit that was quite undemocratic as well. But on the whole, we're nowhere near into the kind of absolute mire that America is in, and thank goodness for that. I do think it's interesting that we are leading with this topic on a show like this. We always talk about America. There's been much less discussion about what are the practical implications, for example, of when Marine Le Pen probably wins in France in the not too distant future, which I think would have much greater repercussions for us domestically in terms of what that means for refugee numbers. Is Marine Le Pen going to send more refugees our way? I think highly likely. In terms of what's in our domestic interest, we have a case of America brain. When Roe v. Wade was repealed in America, we had debates about that in the House of Commons, even though there's no danger of us repealing abortion rights in the same way.
Alicia?
I think there's a real risk that we are seeing, however, the importing of American politics into the UK. I see it within my own party. People who want to essentially introduce evangelical, almost Tea Party-esque policies that are alien to the UK. I think it's really important that we don't allow the same whether it comes to race, whether it comes to abortion, for us to import these narratives, because the UK is fundamentally different to the US. And I think it's really dangerous. I do think there's a risk we overly focus on the US. I completely agree. But at the same time, from my perspective on foreign policy, on national security, there is no one more important than the US. And a Trump premiership is an uncertain future for all of us.
Well, so how do you respond to this headline, the Daily Mail? The former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the global wokerati are trembling so violently you can hear the ice tinkling in their Negronis. But a Trump presidency could be just what the world needs, Alicia.
I think you can imagine that my tweet might have been based off the back of that article.
No.
Exactly. But, Zelensky is not trembling and drinking Negronis. Zelensky is saying, I am fighting for the freedom of the world. We are fighting against irredentist Russia. Why have you all forgotten what you are fighting for? And Trump will have forgotten that. The idea that a deal can be done within 24 hours that somehow stops Russia from rearming and wanting to attack its neighbours again is for the birds.
Emily?
Yeah, and we also have to think about what would happen if Trump became president to the already very heated and difficult and horrible circumstances in the Middle East.
Right.
Trump foreign policy, if he keeps to the policies he had before, will just make matters worse.
Well, I would say to that briefly, I mean, I agree, it's an uncertain future, and I think that the fear about Ukraine is something that should trouble any Conservative that wants to support Donald Trump. However, when Trump was in charge, I would say foreign policy was in a better place. It was safer. There was that element of, when Donald Trump, for example, decided to, thinking about the Middle East, because you mentioned the Middle East, genuinely, Donald Trump acted in a way that was very unpredictable. No one knew what he was going to do next. And I think to a certain level, people were afraid of him. So, you know, in terms of going after the IRGC, for example, if you don't know what Donald Trump is going to do next, then I think
Didn't ripping up that deal with Iran actually help destabilise the region, though, wouldn't you say?
I think the deal was the mistake, personally. I think that was a mistake to empower them in the nuclear weapons.
And what about undermining the world order or turning your back on rules-based foreign policy?
I'm just saying that
and also,
withdrawal from Kabul, Putin's invasion, this all happened under Biden's watch.
But that was Trump's plan, the withdrawal of Afghanistan. Biden chose to occupy. I've been very critical of it.
He chose to follow it in the exact way, despite being in charge and having the ability to do something different.
That's exactly what I just said. But it was still Trump's plan. I think what will be interesting is that Trump is not interested in Ukraine. He's not interested in other parts of the world. He's interested in Iran. That will be his number one foreign policy objective. Maybe China, but that is all he's got space for in his views.
Right. And he also won't do anything about peace in the Middle East. He won't do anything about a two-state solution. He will allow it to continue to drift. He moved the embassy, is what he did. But as far as many people feel, is that he gave a green light to increase settlements, and the ripping up of the...
Well, so has Biden, though. Biden's done nothing to stop that either.
Well, I mean, that's the point. They have increased
under
Joe
Biden. We're going to get a two-state solution anytime soon, regardless of who's in charge of America.
Well, while we're talking about it, since you've all mentioned it, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, let's just show you the headline here, publicly rejects US push for a Palestinian state. Now, the Defence Secretary on Sunday, Grant Shapps, said Netanyahu's comments were very disappointing. Is disappointing the word you would have used? Is it strong enough? I mean, it may have been strong when it comes to sort of diplomatic circles, but what was your view?
Obviously, it is a far more difficult thing for Grant Shapps as Defence Secretary, but my view is you have to be as willing to condemn those who deny Israeli statehood as those who deny Palestinian statehood. You don't get to make a choice. And the reality is, if you look at the ICJ indictment that's been brought forward, whether you agree with it or not, a lot of the basis of that is the language of Netanyahu and his ministers. So I'm surprised that, given that is the basis for a lot of it, that they are not now in some way curtailing their language. But then Netanyahu hasn't got a future long-term as a leader of Israel. This is his only chance to argue for a one-state solution and to be as radical as he can.
And there is an argument that says he's doing so only to prolong his time as Prime Minister. But sticking with the idea of language and what can be done from the UK's perspective in terms of what Israel does, the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, described Netanyahu's comments as completely unacceptable. But even with stronger language, what should actually happen, Emily?
It's completely unacceptable, and it really should not be in the gift of someone's neighbour as to whether or not you are allowed to have statehood or not. That is unacceptable. And yes, of course, it seems to be. It's almost impossible to imagine now, given what has been going on, that there could be a peaceful solution. But in the end, this is all about a failure of politics. It's all about a failure of politicians, and we have been failing the Middle East by not focusing on it sufficiently and not working on it. There was a time when everyone said it was impossible to find peace in Northern Ireland or in South Africa. There can be solutions,
focused on that,
but there has to be focus on it, and there has to be work done.
Well, as a result of that, how should Britain react? I mean, can Britain really do anything to influence what happens in terms of Israeli politics and Netanyahu while he's still in power?
Sorry, may I just say, I think that we can have influence because we come from a grounding of being friends of Israel. So, we have not adopted an anti-Israeli stance. We have always been in favour of a two-state solution, and we're in favour of course, of supporting Israel, but also ensuring that that Palestine has a right, that Palestine state does that. I mean, Alicia is right. I mean, we agree.
Right. Well, what should the approach be then from the UK? Let me put it that way to what Netanyahu has said.
Well, I think that Emily is quite right that actually we are a friend, and friends have the right, I think, to criticise as well as to support. It doesn't mean you have unqualified support no matter what your ally does. And I think, as we've alluded to already, that Netanyahu is exceptionally unpopular. He was unpopular even before October the 7th. There were massive protests going on in Israel, and now I think he's gone into hawk mode as a means of shoring up his base, which is exceptionally fragile. So I don't think it's a good idea for us to think that we should just necessarily agree with everything that Netanyahu says. However, obviously, it takes politics and a lot of work. Well, I'm not sure I'd agree that the West has kind of turned its back. There have actually been numerous occasions on which the West has attempted to broker deals which have come to nothing, often because Palestine has rejected statehood at those conferences.
But not for years.
No,
No, it hasn't been there for a long time. But on that,
but actually, after October 7th, it's going to be very, very difficult after October 7th to get, I think, ordinary rank-and-file Israelis who fear that this is the new normal, and Hamas have said that they will repeat these attacks ad infinitum if they have the capacity. To give statehood to the Gaza Strip now, I mean, how do we think that they would use that statehood?
Well, is that a valid point?
No, it's not, because if you oppress a country and occupy it for best part of, 60 years now, you're going to get resistance, and you're going to get, unfortunately, horrible actors like Hamas grow up in that lack of democracy. If you don't allow people to be free, they will fight for it, and unfortunately, they will fight for it by more and more grotesque means, as we've seen across the world. This is not unique to Israel-Palestine.
Although Hamas is not in favour of democracy.
No, it's not. Of course, it's not. But then, look. We are not a kind of neutral player in this, and we say, we are, as the panel have said, a friend of Israel. We haven't imposed any sanctions on Israel.
Should we?
Yeah, of course.
We have done some against settlers, extremist settlers.
But that's very limited. It's the government that's allowing this to do. And we haven't put any sanctions on key diplomats. We haven't expelled diplomats. We haven't. I mean, look at what Russia's done in Ukraine, and we've done a hell of a lot there. There's no arms embargo. We're still shipping arms to Israel. We're saying, what they're doing is wrong. Might well breach international law, but here have some more weapons to do it. That's really not sending a message that we're tough on this and we're opposed to what they're doing, is it?
Alicia?
So I think there are real questions about what influence does the US and UK have. I mean, I asked David Cameron that when he was front of my committee. I asked it again when I was in the US last week. But for me, it's quite clear what the UK should be doing. We should be creating a Palestine contact group. We should be doing what we do best, which is convening, doing the diplomatic work. We need to start track 2 diplomacy. So that's where you bring together civil society, academics. Actually, there are a lot of average Israelis who want to start that work, start that process, and then let's look at the north. If Hamas has been dismantled in the north, as the Israelis say, well, then it's time to bring in the Palestinian Authority or look at some kind of way of starting to build a process towards a solution. And Cameron, to be fair, to his credit, when I raised this with him when he appeared before my committee, did say he would take away and look at it. But that's what we should be doing, bringing forward solutions. I will say on aid, I give the government full credit. They've worked very hard on aid, and they have managed to get additional routes opened and increase the amount of aid that has got in.
Right. I mean,
the challenge that we should make, I think, to Israeli politicians is to say to them, if we're not going to have a 2-state solution, what are we going to have instead?
Well,
because if you want to have a largely Jewish democratic state, how are you going to have it if half the population is Palestinian? What does that mean in terms of a future for Palestinians?
It means ethnic cleansing. Look at what they're doing now. You can see on the ground what they're doing. You can see in the constitution of Likud, which says Israel should have full sovereignty from the Jordan to the sea. It's very clear. He wants a greater Israel, and so does Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and all the other ghouls in his cabinet. They want a greater Israel that has ethnically cleansed the Palestinians. 85% of the population of Gaza is now displaced. 25,000 are dead, and more are being killed every day. More at risk, tens of thousands at risk of starvation, of death through lack of medicines because they've got injuries, and so on. This is a terrible. What is going on? Whether you call it genocide or not, there's a debate to be had. It's clearly ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. You're seeing ethnic cleansing of the West Bank with settlers expanding constantly. They want to eradicate the Palestinians from what they see as a greater Israel. And that is, unfortunately, not just Netanyahu. That is a much wider group within Israeli politics, unfortunately, at the moment. And it does need very strong diplomatic pressure from countries like the US and the UK, which do have influence over them, because we do arm them and we do give them aid in the case of the US.
But Israel is a democracy that is, that has a enormous. I mean, there are huge kind of battles that go on internally in terms of different ideas and so forth. And as we were saying earlier, the opposition to Netanyahu was growing and growing. There are people within Israel who should
not to what's being done in Palestine necessarily. It was
but also there are people within Israel who want there to be, who believe that the only way that they will have a secure and safe state is to make sure that they have a 2-state solution, and they need to be working on that. But their voices have been shouted out for too long.
And Israel would say, of course, it did start You can argue against it with October the 7th and the massacre there and what has unfolded. But that's what Israel would say. Now, there is a wider comment and argument and discussion to be had about how we prepare for what Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, called a more dangerous world, which he said broadly in a speech last week and again in interviews. Let's have a look at this from Penny Mordaunt, the Leader of the House, on Twitter. The Royal Navy and its partners must keep pace with the growing capabilities of other nations. If not, Britain's interests cannot be secured. And then there was this article from General Lord Richard Dannett, the former Chief of the General Staff, who said we risk repeat of the 1930s unless we invest in our armed forces. Alicia, is the Army, the British Army, big enough to address today's challenges?
I mean, it's really difficult because for me, it's less about size. It's more about specific capabilities and what capabilities are we investing in, what units do we have, and what do we think a future force soldier looks like. That actually is a bigger question. The money, I mean, we've got the biggest budget since the Cold War. Obviously, Grant Shapps has just announced another $5 billion. But yes, there are meaningful questions that need to be asked about whether we have the right military to protect ourselves. But then, for example, the Navy, we do need to keep pace. But at the same time, enormous investment, 13 new ships coming online in the next few years. We are investing, we've got the aircraft carriers, but do we need to do more? Yes, and that's why I think Grant has said we will move to 2.5% of GDP on defence.
Right. Would Labour government spend more on defence than 2.5%, which is what is being proposed?
I think there are a number of things that we need to look at. I think the first thing is that we're going to have a defence and security review if we are elected at the next general election. We need to look at what we have, what we've been doing and what we need. We need to look at our capabilities and what the threats, the up-to-date threats are.
Do you agree, though, with Grant Shapps that we're living in a more dangerous world than in recent times?
Well, we accept that, though, obviously, that there has been increased threats, but, it's such... We need to ensure that the MOD does not continue to waste money. I mean, we've had £15 billion wasted by the MOD since 2010.
So more than under Labour, where we're the biggest black hole in defence spending.
Look at Ajax. What we need to do is we need to make sure that we've got the Office for Value for Money, which is embedded in the MOJ, to make sure that to make sure that we are spending our money effectively. We can't afford to lose £15 billion just like that. We need to make sure we get value for money. We need to make sure that we're really careful about what it is that we're doing and why.
Right. So you're not going to commit, which is understandable, to spending more than 2.5% of GDP. But if Grant Shapps is right and the peace dividend is over, do we need to spend significantly more on defence, just on principle?
I think that on principle we have seen, as a result of recent events, that the government's pivot towards the Far East was a mistake and that we should have continued to focus on Europe and the Middle East in the way that we had been. I think that, we pivoted away to the Far East, now we've pivoted back. I think there was a great waste in that.
Oh, well, Alicia?
I mean, the idea that a pivot to the east is a mistake is absolutely wrong. That is where the majority... No, it is absolutely not wrong. Look, my committee led when Labour was being silent about the fact we needed to not forget the Middle East. It's me, not Labour, who said we were going to see the Gaza crisis of 2023 in July. The opposition on foreign policy and defence has come from the Select Committee, not from Labour. And the reality is we absolutely need to look at the Indo-Pacific. The idea that the risks there are not far more fundamental. If you think what's happened in the Red Sea is bad, if an attack on Taiwan happens, we have seen nothing like what will happen to the reality of our economies around the world. It's absolutely a shift in the Pacific.
Well, then can we afford to ramp up our defence budget or not ramp it up then?
I think we could spend it more wisely. You could scrap Trident, which is a weapon we're never going to use, never have used, never will use. It's not a deterrent and it's a complete waste of money. And we could repurpose that. We could improve accommodation and pay for our military, which would be an important thing to do for one, which has gone down under this government. But actually, if you look at, Penny Mordaunt talks about Britain's interests. I think Britain's interests at the moment are being able to get a GP appointment, being able to find a dentist, being able to get treatment for cancer started promptly if you need it. I think the NHS has probably got a bigger claim. We're going to talk about councils later.
You can't do any of that. You're not safe. National security comes before economic security.
We are one of the only countries in Europe that spends over 2% of our GDP on defence.
Not anymore. People are finally stepping up.
Others are increasing it, but it's still below 2%. So if you look at that, we are spending more on defence, as you said at the beginning, than we were at any point since the Cold War. We are not spending a small amount on defence. We have defence. We have no direct threat. I don't think anybody is waking up in the morning going, oh, my goodness, the bombs are going to start falling from X country at the moment.
But threats don't just come from countries.
No, of course not.
We have got an increased counter-terrorism
but that is about diplomacy. That's about policing. That's about counter-terrorism. It's about our intelligence. It's not just about military spending.
Defence is
I'm not saying it's not
absolutely
important. I'm not saying scrap the defence budget.
You just said scrap Trident.
I did, because it's utterly useless for today's thing. How Trident deterred terrorists?
You think Trident doesn't keep us safe from terrorists?
No, of course it doesn't.
Absolute madness. It
Well,
keeps
we've
us
had
from
how many terrorist attacks have we had in the last
What's the
decade?
point? It's a deterrent, so we haven't had them.
We have had them.
No, sorry,
Manchester,
I thought
London.
you were talking about
I mean, for
nuclear.
goodness
Sorry, I
sake.
thought you were
Every
talking about
single month.
nuclear.
What terrorists have got nuclear weapons?
Sorry, I misheard
Sorry,
you.
Every single month, at least 3 terror attacks in the UK are averted by our secret services and our police.
Absolutely, not by Trident.
A month. Yes, it is. Trident plays a fundamental role, because who do you think is sponsoring
Deterring
that?
terrorists.
Who do you think is sponsoring the terrorism? It's
Saudi
Iran,
Arabia.
It is. So you've just said it's a state.
Yeah,
so
it
therefore
is.
you recognise.
And Saudi Arabia is our ally.
Terrorism.
We've got no sanctions on them, and we're sending them our arms.
Well, let's just get the question,
Come off
Madeleine.
it.
You've just recognised that your whole argument is completely flawed.
I haven't recognised it's
states who are
false.
sponsoring it, they respond to Trident. If we're going to go back to this Corbynista nonsense era of scrapping Trident, not
well, it was
caring
something that
about
Jeremy
it.
Corbyn was in favour of.
And that
personally.
Labour's
It's got nothing to do with that. This is to do with
Yes,
Saudi
it
Arabia
is.
funding. Saudi Arabia is our ally.
This isn't about Saudi Arabia.
Of
It's
course
about
it is.
Trident.
Look at this report that Theresa May suppressed in
God.
2017, which showed where terrorist funding to the
Well,
UK
let's go
came
back
from.
to
and it
do
was
people
Saudi Arabia
worry
that was one of the
most
main
about
countries doing
feeling
it.
safe? Because actually it was something that Jeremy Corbyn personally was in favour of, and voters didn't seem to like it.
I think it's the first and the fundamental thing that guarantees everything else. And actually it does, foreign policy decisions have a dramatic impact on cost of living, for example. Look at the fallout from the war in Ukraine. I mean, even what's going right now in the Red Sea, if you have to send ships around the Horn of Africa rather than through the Red Sea, that adds massively to the cost of living, which is something that voters would immediately feel in their pockets. And as Alicia said, it's the first, most fundamental responsibility of government is to guarantee the safety of its citizens.
But it isn't the only choice.
No.
Obviously, Andrew talked about the health service, but let's have a look in the Daily Mail. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, vows to slash taxes in his March the 6th budget further, because we've had the cuts to national insurance, to help propel a Conservative election victory, just as Nigel Lawson did in the 1980s. Is that what should happen? The money, any fiscal headroom, as we call it, any cash that might be available to the Chancellor, should it go on tax cuts?
I don't think we can either or, but do I want to see tax cuts? Of course I do. I'd love to see Jeremy's proposal to cut business rates, because actually when you cut business rates, you have more business putting more money into the coffers overall and creating more
But
jobs.
you know it's about choices, Alicia. Should it be spent on defence? You've made an impassioned argument for spending on defence.
So I don't know what the headroom is that Jeremy has. I'm actually going to be seeing him this week. Well, this week I'll be sitting down with him to have exact that discussion, because council funding, for example, is something gravely important to me in my area. But I have put forward alternative proposals that don't require a bigger envelope, but just require us to change the formulas that we operate on. You know, there are other ways of improving things without necessarily having to just spend more money, which is always the answer thrown at us.
Tax cuts, Emily, a good way to spend any money that is available, supposedly?
Well, we don't know how much money there is available. We don't know what the headroom is.
They think between 6 and 10 billion,
well,
but that is the speculation.
I mean, it's all speculation, exactly. It's speculation, built on speculation. We have newspapers all
But Labour does believe that the tax burden, which it is, it's not just you believe it, it is the highest on record for the UK. So would you be in favour of cutting it?
What we think is that we need to be able to grow the economy. We need to have some sort of stability, and we will see what. I mean, listen, we've got two budgets. We're told, you know, between now and the general election. Who knows what the state of the economy is going to be if and when the Labour was ever to be elected into government.
But would it make it easier for people in terms of cost of living if taxes were cut in that March the 6th budget or not?
We don't know what the state of the economy is. I can't be sitting here, you know, predicting what it is that Labour would do in these circumstances in this studio. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Jo.
Well, you have said you've increased £28 billion.
I think that what we need to be doing is we need to make sure that we have within our fiscal rules. We need to be able to ensure that we have stability, and from that we grow our economy, and in that way we ensure that we have the sort of funding that we need in order to look after our public services.
Right.
That's how it works in that way round.
Why is Emily being coy over the question of where and how you might spend any cash at the March 6th budget?
Well, look, I think Emily's got her reasons. She's not the Shadow Chancellor, so she's not here to set out Labour's financial policy. But look, I think the reality is, if you wanted to do something to help with the cost of living crisis, you'd increase benefits. That's what you do. You'd increase the amount of money going into building new housing, because that's where the cost of living crisis is coming from. It's people's housing costs.
We've increased it in line with inflation.
Yes,
that's what we've done every single time.
If you look at benefits today, they're worth about 14% of average wages. If you go back a generation, they were worth about 25%.
But you think going up with inflation is a small thing, given that inflation's been so high?
I think it's a very small thing. It's keeping it where it is in real terms, obviously. So it's neutral. So it's silly to say it's some great generosity.
Well, it is because
it's not. You've got more people using food banks. You've got more 600,000 more children in poverty since your government has been in.
More people working than ever before.
No, you haven't. Unemployment's going up. So don't talk nonsense. Come on.
It's really not.
Unemployment's going up. Just look at the last ONS figures. Unemployment's going up, and it's forecast to go up to 1.6 million by the OBR. Yes, it is.
It has been low, and it is going up. It is just starting to go.
Yes.
But it is just starting to go up. But it has been at a record.
But we also have
record
amounts of people in low wages. We have a record amount of children that spent the last Christmas in temporary accommodation because they can't afford housing. We are in a terrible state as a country. We have more people using food banks than ever. You can't deny this. We are in a cost of living crisis.
And as a result of that, there are
housing costs.
And as a result of that, there are political choices. I mean, listening to what Andrew said, where do you think the money, if it's there at all, up to £10 billion should be used or spent?
Well, it's the difficulty with any tax cuts is that they would have to be meaningful enough that they would, if you were going to start championing your massive tax cut that you've given to citizens, they would have to be significant enough that they would not be outweighed by the effects of fiscal drag, where because of rising inflation, more people are ushered into the higher tax threshold. So that there is that difficulty too, because although they tried to unveil not too long ago tax cuts, people in the opposition and many Conservatives pointed out that actually this was more than outweighed by the fiscal drag impact.
The freeze on the income tax.
Yes, exactly. Which means more people are paying higher rate of tax. I mean, there's one Conservative MP amongst about 40 who are calling for something quite different in terms of where any extra money should go. Let's have a listen to Ben Bradley.
Fortunately, we've seen over the weekend the Chancellor saying he's got more headroom than he thought in terms of his kind of looking forward to the budget and what he's able to do around tax cuts. We'd like to see some of that funding come to local government, where, of course, councils have tax-raising powers too. So there's no point cutting national taxes just to see everybody's council tax go up by the maximum.
Well, that was Ben Bradley. He is on the programme tomorrow. Do you agree with him, Alicia?
I do, and look, since I was elected, I've been calling for more money for local councils, but I've also been putting forward sensible ways that doesn't just require more money overall. As I said, social mobility funding, we should look at social mobility alongside deprivation within funding formulas. Rurality is a real priority because actually if you've seen poverty in rural areas, it is like something you will never, ever forget. We need to make sure those councils in the most rural areas can fund it. It's difficult, but this is something I've been working on non-stop since I was elected.
I mean, what would Labour do in terms of helping cash-strapped councils? I mean, there is an argument that says that they've had their budgets cut and cut repeatedly since 2010.
We've had so little consistency over the last 14 years. We've had councils being told what funding they're going to get from local government just a few weeks before they have to put their budgets forward. We would change that. We would certainly not. We would give them long-term funding so they understood what it is that they were allowed to do. We would devolve powers to them so that there would be more that they could do in terms of housing, in terms of developing skills in order to build the economies in their areas. We would not be having this kind of, I don't know what you would call it, this sort of bear pit where different towns are bidding against each other for this levelling up funding,
which
seems to have more to do with whether or not your MP is in a marginal Tory seat than anything else. Look at the independent, look at the independent assessment.
I got it. I have one of the safest Conservative seats in the country, and I got £23.7 million for my communities. Not because I'm so brilliant, but because the proposal they put forward was going to have a meaningful impact on the economy in our communities. That is the absolute evidence that this is absolute nonsense. It's really offensive to civil servants when you say that they are happily signing things off.
Well, it depends the basis upon which the civil servants are asked to
so how does Rutland and Melton justify it? How does Rutland and Melton fit into your narrative?
Oh, who knows? I mean, there will be things like, the means of transport that people have, whether or not there are sufficient numbers.
Where's the political narrative that you're arguing that I got the money because I've got one?
Listen, the political narrative, comes from listening to, doesn't it? The Prime Minister, when he was trying to get elected in Tunbridge Wells, where he said, well, guess what we've been able to do? We've been able to move money from poorer areas to places like this. That's the real narrative. It's keeping Tories happy.
That is not what he said.
Well, I mean, Andrew, but should
city councils to places like this? Actually.
But Andrew, should Labour commit to billions of pounds, if there are billions of pounds, on councils?
Yeah, look, councils are receiving £15 billion less compared with 2010 in their core funding. So that's why we've got these crises. That's why councils around the country are going bust or on the brink of going bust. Not Labour councils, Thurrock is a Tory council, Woking is a Tory council.
Hang on, there are councils across the board. Lib Dem councils, Conservative councils and Labour councils are going bust for different reasons.
They are. They are.
Accusations of mismanagement in some Labour councils,
in some cases,
and the same in some Tory
councils as well.
Yeah.
And also legacy payments to women when they changed the rules about which jobs were considered
yes, equal pay is an issue in some councils as well. There are a myriad of reasons, but there are also a number of councils, about 40, that are on the brink, which is why these Conservative MPs today have written, which is why the Local Government Association, which is cross-party, have been lobbying on this for ages. And people are fed up. You know, look, I live in Croydon, which went bust in 2021 originally and has gone bust twice since under both Labour and Conservatives. And our council tax went up 15% last year with the connivance of the Conservative Mayor and Michael Gove. We are not even in the most 10 indebted councils in the country, and yet we had to pay that burden. And people are fed up with paying 5% more every year to get less services. Services are being cut, and that has terrible effects. You look at social care, there are 2.5 million adults not getting the care they need because of the social care cuts. And that has an impact on the NHS because people can't be discharged from the NHS into care because there aren't packages to keep people safe in their community.
And no government's dealt with the issue
of social care. And so it's causing huge problems right across the board. And until we fund local government seriously, we're not going to be able to tackle things like homelessness, like the rising cost of living crisis. So
what do you make of this group of Conservative MPs? I mean, 40 MPs saying help councils. I mean, politically, is it going to work?
I don't know if it's going to work politically. I think they have a good case. I mean, councils are expected to do more with less. However, there are so many councils where what is at the heart of their financial concerns has been massive profligacy on absolute terrible decisions made. I mean, Croydon is a good example. After they went bust, was it in 2020, the chief executive departs who'd presided over this mess, and they give her almost £500,000 in payout. I mean, I think this is shocking, and I don't think people want to see throwing good money after bad. And I actually think until we have a discussion about how many councils are run...
But that's quite small scale. I mean, that £500,000 cut. Last year, our adult social services were cut by £12 million, which is 24 times as much.
My council, Rutland, has the best adult social care in the country, and yet we're one of the worst funded unitaries in the country.
All right, and on that, because we have the budget coming on March the 6th...
People who are in charge of massive budgets enjoy almost very little of the accountability that we apply to Westminster politicians. We also need to have a conversation about how local government is run and the kind of people who go into it.
And on that note, we're going to end down because we won't have time otherwise for our last subject, which is completely different because a school led by the self-styled strictest head teacher, Catherine Birbalsingh, is being challenged in the High Court over a policy amounting to a prayer ban. A Muslim student at the school told the High Court the policy is discriminatory. Let's have a look at some of the reaction to the story. This is Trevor Kavanagh in The Sun. Superhead Catherine Birbalsingh isn't just fighting for her school. Her spat with hardliners could alter Britain. But this is the headline in The Guardian by Nadine Asbali. This ban on Muslims praying in school is a dystopian, sinister vision of Britishness. Now, I think we can talk. We've had some problems getting the line to Nadine, but I think we can talk to her now. She is a secondary school teacher in London and author of Veiled Threat on Being Visibly Muslim in Britain. Welcome to you. Nadine, you've criticised the actions of the school. Why are they wrong to ban prayer?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I think they're wrong because they're banning something that is done up and down the country, which is essentially not an issue. I mean, I understand in Michaela they have very restrictive a very restrictive building. They have a very specific way that they run the school. But I think they're wrong because banning it outright as such a trigger reaction to what Birbalsingh describes as an environment where more and more children were praying, where some children were starting to, wear the headscarf where they didn't before. I think that's the wrong route to go down. I think if there were behaviour issues around managing prayer, then absolutely that should have been dealt with. But I think banning something that is not just a fundamental to Muslim students, but is a human right and something that we teach in schools as a British value that we should be allowed in this country, I think that's kind of the wrong reaction.
Nadine, stay with us. Madeleine, what do you make of that response to what Catherine Birbalsingh has done?
Well, I think the important thing to know about Catherine Birbalsingh's school is that they have a system whereby lots of different groups, faith groups, are expected to, in some cases, make sacrifices for the create some kind of common good and an atmosphere in which the strict traditional ethos of the school can be enacted. So, for example, the children at the school always eat vegetarian meals to avoid offending anyone because of their religious sensibilities. Now, I'm curious as to why the parents of this child who are bringing this case forward, why they enrolled their child at a school, having known that they were very clear and transparent about the fact that there was not a prayer room at the school.
It was.
Sorry?
It was. The right was taken away from that child.
I think she said, Catherine Birbalsingh, I've seen her being interviewed, in which she has said that we'd never had a prayer room, and this is made very clear
this child was allowed to pray, and then the right was taken away.
They were allowed to pray out school. They were doing it outside.
No, it was in school.
Yeah, outside the school, as in they didn't have a prayer room, and this was made very, very clear to them. I'm sort of, I think there's something rather sinister about this case. It smacks of a sort of, I don't know. I mean, I think I don't know how, for example, they were able to get such a large sum of money to bankroll a barrister to pay for a case against a school that is getting the most fantastic results, that was always very clear and transparent about what its policy was, that it does run a sort of secular policies. You know, there are plenty, if you want, there are faith schools that you could go to, schools that do it differently.
All right, well, more broadly, Nadine, in response to that, Catherine Birbalsingh does talk of Michaela School as a secular school, but the school has said in this case that allowing demonstrative prayer risks undermining inclusion and social cohesion between pupils. Do you think there is a threat that could create division?
I think there's a few things to say on that. I think it's actually a misconception that schools in Britain are secular. Schools are obliged to provide a daily opportunity for Christian prayer or Christian worship, and lots of schools opt out of that. So actually, we don't have a secular system in this country. Secondly, I think it's really interesting and to be honest, sinister how prayer is viewed as this kind of default. And I will say specifically, because the court case talks about ritualistic prayer, which is obviously, you know, some faiths and not others. I think it's quite sinister how that has been viewed as something that threatens social cohesion, when actually anyone who's a teacher knows that Michaela School really values duty, self-sacrifice, personal responsibility. And the idea of a 13-year-old sacrificing just 5 minutes of their lunchtime to pray in the courtyard, which, by the way, they were doing before that was banned. So actually, this wasn't about having a prayer room at first. The right to pray even in the courtyard was taken away from these students. I think, you know, a child choosing to do that for 5 minutes of their lunchtime is actually quite commendable. And it just feels a bit like a double standard that the school, you know, values those values when it's in the name of Britishness, which Birbalsingh specifically references. You know, in the name of Britishness, we all have to sacrifice something. Well, actually, you're asking Muslim students to sacrifice something that is absolutely fundamental to their faith, whereas other students are not having to set anything aside to be able to be British. So I think there's a real double standard here.
All right, well,
and
you think it's a double standard. Let me bring our other guests in, Nadine.
Let me bring Alicia. Perhaps they can't have a prayer room, but taking away the right of students to be able to pray outside and saying that automatically has ruined the social cohesion of the school.
All right, I don't know if you can hear me, Nadine, but we'll just stop you there. But Alicia, you were going to respond.
I think we have to be quite cautious, because I think there's clearly a lot more going on here than we necessarily know, and so I think we have to be cautious. But for all we know, there could be incredibly devout Catholics at that school who are choosing not to go and pray. And actually, from all my Muslim friends, and I will never pretend to be an expert on Islam, but there is no requirement for you necessarily to pray at that time. You could choose to do so later. But schools are not legally obliged to enable prayers. That is not the law. They're not required to do so. As we said, there was a requirement for Christian practice, but that has been opted out of. But I think overall, I think we have to be really cautious about not allowing this to become some kind of culture war issue again. And I think we have to be very careful. There will be specifics in this case that we are not aware of yet. And so I do think, although, you know, everyone's very keen to have their view on it, we should actually wait for the whole court case to play out so we know the realities of what were taking place in these playgrounds. Was it safe? Was it not? The way it was done, the way it was not. Just a lot of caution, I think, is needed.
Should a school have the right to decide on these sorts of issues individually about whether children and pupils can and should be allowed to pray, or whether there's a prayer room, or should it be up to the individual school if they think it's causing problems?
I think, well, look, if it's causing problems and there are disciplinary problems, they should be dealt with separately from this, and I don't think it's helpful to confuse those two issues. But I think it'd be helpful if there was guidance from the Department for Education. Personally, I'm secular myself. I have no truck with any religion at all. They're all equally, you know, bizarre in my mind. But If people believe them, they have a right of freedom of expression in this country. In fact, that's one of the British values we now teach in schools, is about freedom of expression and freedom of religion. And if a child wants to pray for 5 minutes in their lunch break, whether that's in the school playground or in a quiet room somewhere that's not being used, I cannot see how that harms anyone else. And to me, that's the principle. If it doesn't harm anyone else, what's the problem? And if there are different disciplinary issues that Catherine Birbalsingh, Britain's most attention-seeking head teacher, has found with this, then you know, they should be raised and dealt with separately. But bringing religion into it just feels like her inflaming a culture war yet again.
Nadine, we'll say goodbye to you at this point. And apologies for the sound problems. Just very briefly, Emily, where are you?
I can't comment on this case, but I do think that people should be allowed to pray in their free time.
All right. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for today. And I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15. From all of us here, bye-bye.